10 years ago, a mysterious fog descended and swallowed everything, forcing protagonist to run for his life, while countless monsters hid within that darkness to hunt, and they began a systematic slaughter of humanity, painting the entire world in blood as the chaos spread, leaving even the most advanced military jets and missiles completely powerless against the encroaching nightmare, because ordinary civilians exposed to the fog eventually petrified and died, and if the fog remained, it would eventually swallow the entire globe. But then the God-chosen job holders emerged to fight back, using rare classes like archers, swordsmen, and magicians to push the monsters back, since the only way to clear the fog is by defeating every monster hiding inside the dungeons. So these warriors became humanity's final ray of hope, and now protagonist and his squad are facing a relentless gray wolf, with the beast landing a direct, devastating hit on protagonist. As his teammates desperately try to keep the monster at bay, launching everything they have to stop the creature from advancing. Yet even with their combined strength, they realize this level 2 monster is far too powerful, so they decide to abandon the injured protagonist as a decoy to save themselves, leaving him alone in the wreckage as his consciousness slips into a dark, painful void where he struggles to breathe while the cold weight of death presses down on him. But he suddenly wakes up, confused, thinking he just finished his overtime shift. Looking down at his own hands, protagonist realizes this body and face are not his own, and flashes of a stranger's life begin burning through his mind, as he sees memories of monsters and dungeon fog flooding his consciousness, wondering if he somehow reincarnated into a new world as a professional hunter while the dark reality of this body's past hits him, a disposable decoy left to rot in a dungeon, and he questions why he did not wake up with a cheat skill or system to handle these attacks. Until a sudden prompt breaks his train of thought, announcing that a reward selection system has finally been activated for his dungeon clear, which is a bizarre mechanic he has never encountered in all his time. But realizing he can actually choose his own power-ups means he might just become the strongest player ever, so he immediately snaps up an S-class sword and a class armor to start his climb, with the system confirming his new gear, a wolf-slaying blade and a defensive guard. And he realizes that snagging top-tier rewards on the first try is practically unheard of, as he grips his new blade, knowing better gear is the only way to tackle harder dungeons, since the world outside is crawling with lethal threats and he needs to get strong fast. So he accepts his new life as a hunter, the only path left for his survival, and steps out into the neon-lit city, fully committed to mastering this broken system. Seeing that even this new world is infested with the same fog and monsters he fled before, until he finally heads home to organize his thoughts and plot his next move, as the dark, misty horizon warns him that his real fight is only just beginning. Thick fog suddenly swallows the bus, triggering an ominous warning system that signals an immediate monster threat, and the passengers descend into sheer panic as they realize they are trapped in a lethal hunting ground. But the protagonist knows ordinary people stand zero chance against this, forcing him to step up, so he tries to maintain order while the bus vibrates violently under the pressure of the mist, as the driver desperately attempts to accelerate, but the fog keeps encroaching on their path. Then a sudden, massive impact rocks the vehicle, signaling the monster has finally arrived, with a scorching beam of energy slicing right through the middle of the bus, and the entire structure begins to collapse, leaving the survivors convinced they are doomed because they know only rare job holders can fight these monsters and none are present. But the protagonist calmly prepares to exit the wreckage, his resolve hardening for the fight as he confirms his status as a job holder, ready to face the creature head-on. While one of the survivors expresses desperate relief, thinking their salvation is finally here, so the protagonist decides it is the perfect moment to test out his newly acquired gear. But he stays vague about his actual level when the guy on the bus asks, and the man stares at him in stunned silence, clearly unimpressed by his low-level rank, while the surrounding crowd starts to berate him for being a useless level 1 warrior, because in this world, a warrior's job is considered the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. So the protagonist ignores the insults and activates his combat mode, shimmering with energy, as the system locks his A-class Wolf Guard into place, significantly boosting his defensive capabilities, and he stands ready to engage the threat, finally showing everyone what he is capable of. The level 2 Rhino Beast charges, but the protagonist readies his S-class Wolf Sword, noting that while his level remains low, the gear bridges the gap, and he channels enough energy to match a level 3 fighter, lunging forward with a strike that cuts through the monster's thick hide. The blade connects and forces the creature back with a massive shockwave, then he follows up by slamming the sword deep into the beast's skull, proving that even the most mediocre job can overcome limits through relentless effort. And realizing that this specific weapon is his path to becoming the strongest, he plunges the glowing blade into the monster's maw to finish it, effectively putting the beast down for good in a single fluid exchange, while the nearby survivors watch in disbelief, marveling at the clean, high-level combat. So the protagonist checks the system drop, though he feels cheated by the measly reward, then he walks away as the crowd watches him leave, still buzzing from the fight, which attracts the attention of a mysterious girl observing the aftermath from the shadows, and she wonders who could have pulled off such an impressive feat. As a guy from the crowd explains he was just a level 1 warrior, the girl questions if he used some kind of special cheat item while she tracks him to a secluded building, certain this is the right place, moving quickly through the halls to catch up with her target, and she finally corners him, ready to demand answers about his power. Recalling the memories of this body, the protagonist realizes he has inherited a mountain of debt, and he sees the original owner blew his chance on high-end weapons that went to waste, so a debt collector corners him in the hallway to demand immediate repayment. But the collector pushes the deadline to 3 days for 5 million yen, which leaves the protagonist walking away with a stern warning that the apartment is on the line, forcing him back inside to stare down his bleak financial future. And he checks his phone for any potential way to dig himself out of this hole, noticing a job board notification for high-paying party recruits. Plus, he spots a market for selling dungeon loot to clear his record, so the protagonist resolves to climb to the top of this world and ignore the petty threats. He reviews the knowledge of his predecessor regarding how dungeons spawn and how job holders train, finding that his only path forward is to get stronger and hunt better gear right now. While he scrolls through a shop interface listing rare weapons like rifles and swords, noting that high-tier gear costs a fortune, often exceeding 700,000 credits, meaning he has to clear a dungeon every single day to meet that impossible 3-day deadline, remembering how easily he slaughtered monsters in his last outing with his new gear, and he concludes that a level 3 dungeon is well within his reach, so he locks his phone, finally setting a concrete plan in motion. Then he prepares for the hunt tomorrow to start paying off his debts, until the next morning arrives and he heads straight for the dungeon entrance. The city center is safe thanks to the job holders clearing out the fog, but straying too far from the core means entering true danger zones, which is exactly where the protagonist heads for the better rewards he needs, though he ignores a level 2 dungeon entrance to push his luck even further, and 3 random party members approach him, mocking his reputation as a dead warrior, so he politely declines their offer to group up, citing his need to test his own limits alone. The mocking party leader laughs at his ambition, telling him he should stick to dishwashing, while the female party member chimes in to insult his trash-tier job class and past failures. He stays silent, knowing the memories of the body's previous owner are not his own, but he carries the weight of the new reward system, confident that his luck has finally shifted. They continue to berate him for wasting his last savings on a job change card. And their taunts only harden his resolve to prove them wrong in the field. He smiles to himself, realizing that clearing his debt will be a long, brutal grind. The group is left confused by his cryptic response as he turns his back on them. They whisper about using him as a simple decoy or shield for their own boss fight. He walks right past them, ignoring their schemes to reach a glowing level 3 portal. The system confirms his selection, asking if he is ready to enter the fortress dungeon. Having no other choice to make his fortune, he walks straight into the blue light. The portal consumes him instantly, pulling the protagonist into the heart of the challenge, and he steps into the dungeon, finally ready to start his climb from the bottom. The mission notification flashes across the screen, tasking the protagonist with clearing out every bandit in the fortress. As he surveys the terrain, a group of seasoned adventurers approaches him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Taking it all in, the protagonist notes how this dungeon environment feels completely alien compared to the real world. Relying on his new body's memories, he recalls that these job holder missions are the only way to secure real rewards. His entry into the level 3 dungeon does not go unnoticed by the veterans already waiting near the portal. The apparent leader of the group steps up, demanding that the protagonist reveal his job class and current level, and the tension spikes when they see his credentials, instantly marking him as a low-level liability to their squad despite their clear annoyance. The protagonist remains unfazed, sizing up their balanced composition of snipers and a dedicated healer. The leader openly mocks him for bringing a level 1 warrior into a high-danger dungeon, while the party's healer voices her frustration, clearly convinced that his presence will only drag the entire team down. Catching a glimpse of his high-tier gear, the squad starts to whisper about him being some spoiled rich kid. The leader assumes his expensive armor is just a safety net for his incompetence, but eventually agrees to let him join. Internally, the protagonist knows the truth is far grimmer. As he is only here to grind his way out of massive debt, the leader takes charge, immediately barking out orders and assigning the protagonist to the front line as their shield. He tries to reassure the protagonist that the party healer has his back, though the tone feels more like a command setting boundaries. The protagonist warns the group that he will not be acting as a mindless meat shield for their benefit. He remembers how the previous owner of this body died, and he is determined not to repeat those same fatal errors. Protests erupt from the party members who refuse to lead the charge, expecting him to take the brunt of the danger, realizing their cooperation is conditional at best. The protagonist accepts their terms, knowing he cannot rely on them for anything, and with the party finally moving out, he watches the group advance, ready to test his skills in the heat of battle. An elderly villager cries out for help as a band of enemies closes in. The system countdown hits 0, signaling an immediate ambush from a dozen armed bandits. Our party holds their ground at the village gate while the attackers swarm them with blades. The protagonist levels his firearm at the incoming wave. Questioning if a level 3 dungeon is truly this simple, he fires point-blank into the fray, but the lead bandit expertly deflects the projectile with his sword. Noticing their reaction speed rivals fog monsters, the protagonist realizes his initial plan is falling apart. Go-Yunhashi signals him to coordinate their fire and cut off the enemy escape routes. The bandits close the distance effortlessly, slicing through the air as if the bullets never existed. Scanning the battlefield, the protagonist notes their defense stats are significantly higher than expected. One bandit leaps high to deliver a crushing blow, only for the female healer to intervene with a magical barrier. A second attacker tries to exploit the opening, swinging his blade directly toward the protagonist. The protagonist parries the lethal strike at the last second, barely keeping the sharp steel at bay. Sparks fly from the intense impact as their weapons lock together in a display of raw power, distancing himself from the engagement. The protagonist recalibrates his stance while the bandit prepares a follow-up. The attacker lunges again with a furious roar, clearly driven by a desperate need to survive. His eyes widen in genuine terror as he realizes his massive sword has been compromised. A clean, precise strike from the protagonist shatters the bandit's blade and ends the threat instantly. Tato Takemura watches the display with a smirk, finally acknowledging that the protagonist is a genuine threat. Despite the small victory, the protagonist finds himself swarmed by the remaining hostile group members. He grips his own blade with a cold, focused stare and challenges the entire lot to attack him at once. The protagonist senses the barrel of a firearm leveled directly at his position, and he barely has a second to register the threat before lead starts flying. The hostile group members do not even hesitate to open fire, regardless of the bandits standing in their own line of sight, forcing the protagonist to realize he is caught in a deadly crossfire between his enemies and their own allies. A grinning gunman pulls the triggers with no regard for the chaos erupting on the battlefield, and the protagonist wonders if he is the only one they are trying to take down in this reckless barrage. One of the gunmen cackles at the carnage, clearly enjoying the total lack of restraint shown by his squad, while bullets ping off the protagonist's A-class armor, draining its durability with every impact. Surviving this onslaught would be impossible without high-tier gear, and he questions the sanity of a team willing to kill their own comrades. Deflecting the incoming shots with his blade, the protagonist forces his way through the lethal hail, noting how the gunmen continue to fire blindly into the cluster of struggling bandits. So he decides to make them pay for their cold-blooded indifference toward their own men, shifting his focus away from the surviving bandits to target the heart of the hostile group's ranged line. With a swift motion, he redirects the kinetic energy of a deflected bullet, forcing the hostile gunmen to scramble for cover as their own heavy-duty defenses fail. Just as the dungeon system announces the arrival of the fortress boss, a hulking nightmare emerging from the debris, and the sight of this massive threat sends the remaining bandits into a state of pure, unadulterated panic. While the protagonist observes the boss's glowing marks, his own combat buffs surging to meet the challenge, the fortress boss lets out a deafening roar, his sheer presence dwarfing the previous combatants, and the protagonist acknowledges the gravity of the situation, realizing that the real fight has only just begun. The fortress boss slams into the ground, instantly crushing the bandits who were foolish enough to stand in his path, and he launches himself into the air, seeking out the next target in his path of destruction, landing with a brutal stomp that turns his victim into a bloodied mess before the protagonist can even react, while a nearby bandit yells at his companions to stop attacking blindly, finally realizing their reckless tactics are only enraging the beast. Fortress boss towers over the wounded protagonist, his sheer physical pressure forcing the man to cough up blood. Then he executes a devastating strike that sends the protagonist flying through the air. As a fellow bandit screams at the protagonist to keep the boss busy so he can sneak in a killing blow, the protagonist scoffs at the blatant attempt to use him as a meat shield, promising that this coward will soon know true terror, but he signals the other bandit to move in, pretending to take the bait, clashing his blade against the fortress boss to test the monster's defenses, and he quickly realizes that even his high-grade weapon is failing to leave a scratch on that hide. Deducing that the boss must have a specific gimmick or hidden mechanic required to bypass its defenses, he calls out to his companion to keep drawing the aggro, positioning himself perfectly as the fortress boss charges forward with lethal intent. The monster unleashes a massive knuckle bomb strike, and the protagonist narrowly avoids being pulverized, letting the shockwave shatter the ground where he just stood. As the system confirms the boss has locked onto him as the primary target, he watches the fortress boss pivot mid-stride, now fully committed to hunting him down, so he begins a high-stakes dance, baiting the monster into overextending its reach, until the system confirms he is officially locked as the target, forcing him to hold his ground against the incoming onslaught. The protagonist lures the fortress boss straight toward the bandit, who desperately begs him to stand his ground and fight together, but the protagonist forces the bandit into the path of a massive earth-shattering strike, and the system updates to confirm the boss has officially shifted its target lock, pinning the bandit as the primary threat while the protagonist slips away, so the monster slams into the bandit, completely overwhelming him in an instant, leaving the panicked bandit to realize he has been marked by the boss's lethal gaze, as the protagonist executes his plan by using his own ally as a sacrificial pawn, which makes the bandit scream in realization that he has been betrayed, and the protagonist calmly reminds him that having a reliable partner matters most during a boss fight, while the bandit desperately flees chased by the rampaging monster, and Mei Nagasawa intervenes, activating a cage scroll to lock the area down. creating a glowing magical prison around the boss and the trapped bandit, which seals them inside a 10-second containment field. So the bandit pounds against the energy barrier, begging to be released, but the fortress boss ignores his pleas, focusing all its rage onto the man trapped in the cage, and the bandit cries out in terror as the monster looms over him, until the system registers the final blow against the job holder, marking the bandit as dead after the boss obliterates him. And Mei Nagasawa watches in horror, shocked by the protagonist's ruthless willingness to sacrifice a comrade. The protagonist keeps his eyes on the prize, deciding that the boss is the only thing that actually matters, while Mei Nagasawa questions if he has lost his mind, insisting they cannot possibly win alone, but he ignores her doubts and draws his blade, ready to test his new theory, and the system warns that the fortress boss has locked onto him as the primary threat, leaving the protagonist standing his ground as the cage scroll timer ticks down to 5 seconds. Since the fortress boss has shrugged off every high-class weapon attack thrown his way so far and the monster lets out a roar, his impenetrable armor glowing with raw power as the protagonist dashes toward him, calculating the exact point where the defense might fail with only 1 second left on the clock. He commits to a single desperate strike. Then the cage field shatters and the fortress boss lunges forward with everything he has. The protagonist lunges inward, putting every bit of his focus into the tip of his sword, while Mei Nagasawa narrowly dodges the wake of the monster's massive, sweeping arm, and the blade finds the one microscopic gap in the boss's legendary defense, piercing deep into the monster's chest as the system registers the lethal hit, with the protagonist pulling his sword free as the massive threat finally begins to collapse, and the system announces the boss has been defeated, dissolving the monster into light. While the protagonist gains experience and levels up to rank 3, his risky gamble paying off in full because he knew that even an impenetrable defense has a single point of failure, and the game rewards him with a cascade of loot, making the protagonist giddy with anticipation until Mei Nagasawa calls out to him, finally breaking his moment of victory. Mei Nagasawa tries to claim a share of the loot, pointing out how her team served as bait for the boss. But the protagonist reminds her that she only survived because he carried the fight, and he shuts down their demand to split the treasure, forcing the pair to back away, stopping them dead in their tracks with a cold glare and a drawn blade. So Mei Nagasawa frantically warns that attacking them would violate the Bureau's strict rules, though the protagonist retorts that they would be dead without his intervention, demanding some actual gratitude, which terrifies the pair into stammering out a shaky thank you for saving their lives, and he tells them to get lost before he changes his mind about keeping them alive, as the dungeon system activates, granting him 3 picks from a rare selection menu, showing an array of high-tier skills like Sleep, Glow, and Quick Move, and the protagonist realizes he has just unlocked access to ultra-rare SS-class skill books, noting the passive benefits of these skills, which allow for training during sleep and massive speed boosts, while he considers how these abilities will drastically accelerate his growth as a fighter, remembering the narrow escape during the boss chase that proved he needs to get faster, so he decides to sell off the quick draw skill to immediately clear $1 million in debt, realizing that these powerful rewards finally give him the means to control his own destiny, and he commits to plundering every hidden treasure within the infinite dungeon levels, seeing the potential to shift the balance of the world with this newfound strength, so he pulls out his phone to check the market price for his remaining skill books, finding that eager buyers have already started bidding up the prices for his rare finds. The protagonist locks in a deal for over 1 million credits, and he heads home to immediately test the dream cultivation skill, collapsing onto his bed as the world fades into darkness, where the system confirms the activation of his new cultivation ability, prompting him to realize his senses are even sharper within this mental projection. But he barely has time to process the space before a shadow emerges, and the system issues a direct command to defeat his opponent, forcing the protagonist to parry a lethal strike with instinctive precision, while metal rings out as he deflects the incoming blade, moving with a fluid intensity he never possessed before tonight, reflecting on the fact that true growth requires testing himself against real threats. So he stares down the Phantom Warrior and prepares for the next wave of combat drills to push his limits, beckoning his training partner to engage him with everything they have. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of the Anti-Gray Zone Bureau, officials monitor a digital map tracking the latest surges in hostile activity, where the deputy director rages about the sheer frequency of these gray zone breaches, demanding his staff find an immediate countermeasure before the situation spirals out of control, until a subordinate interrupts him with a major discovery regarding the recent incidents, revealing that an unknown entity might be the key to solving these mysterious surges. The Bureau has finally captured a live Firebringer. An interrogation reveals this individual was never mentioned in the Prophet's predictions, leaving the lead investigator shocked that they have finally found a flaw in the prophecy, so she confers with her senior officer, confirming they have a real chance to crack the Prophet's ability if they can track this new anomaly down, and she immediately orders a door-to-door search along the suspect's known bus route while across town. The protagonist wakes up after an intense night in the dream arena, letting out a weary breath as the physical toll of his mental training finally hits him, walking through the quiet streets while reflecting on the exhaustion that comes with fighting hundreds of dream selves. Yet he keeps his hood low to avoid drawing attention while navigating the morning crowd, checking his status screen to see that his basic sword technique has leveled up to 3, along with new mastery in wind control, marking a massive jump in his combat stats, knowing that even with the heavy stamina cost, these dream-cultivated skills are worth the price. When he suddenly notices a figure waiting for him in the narrow alleyway ahead, the scavenger he was expecting has arrived, looking just as rough as the last time they met, so the protagonist approaches the man with the promised goods in hand, asking if the man is indeed the one selling the rare skill book, which he produces from his jacket to confirm the trade. And they exchange the currency and the book in a quick practice transaction, though the scavenger sneers at the protagonist's luck, mocking him for getting such a high-tier manual for a measly 800,000, but the protagonist quickly cuts him off, reminding him that they had originally agreed on a price of 1.2 million. And the scavenger responds by pulling a gun on the kid, deciding he would rather take the money back by force. The scavenger demands the skill book back, gun leveled at the protagonist's face, but a shockwave of force erupts before he can even pull the trigger, and the protagonist slams the man against the wall, hand locked tight around his throat, mocking the scavenger's belief that a level 4 could ever pose a threat to him. So the man gasps for air, choking as the protagonist dismisses his pathetic attempt at intimidation, watching the scavenger struggle as his grip stays absolute. Then the protagonist lets him drop, playfully reminding him that messing with the administration bureau would only lead to a world of trouble, while checking his digital wallet to confirm the full 1.4 million payout has hit his account. And the scavenger, now desperate to survive, scrambles to hand over the book and his weapon, begging for mercy and praising the protagonist, claiming the book will finally allow him to challenge the high-stakes dungeon, though the protagonist pauses, curious about this lethal place that promises such massive profit. So the scavenger explains that the Cataclysm dungeon is the hottest topic on the professional forums right now, described as a zombie-infested hellscape where death is almost a certainty for the unprepared, yet the rewards are so absurdly high that even a single successful run would change a warrior's life forever. And the protagonist scans the forum posts, realizing he has found the perfect high-risk, high-reward challenge. While the scavenger warns him that the survival rate for this dungeon is barely over 1%, but the protagonist only smirks at the impossible odds, deciding that he will never know his own limits unless he steps into that nightmare himself. And he turns toward the shimmering portal, drawing his blade as the air crackles with energy, before leaping straight into the vortex to claim the rewards for himself. The skepticism of the surrounding low-level warriors is palpable, as they mock the protagonist for thinking he can handle this hellscape alone, but the system notification confirms the brutal objective. Survive 3 days of non-stop zombie waves, so the protagonist ignores the noise and marches into the portal with a grin that screams he's ready for the chaos, instantly finding himself high above a ruined cityscape where the true scale of the disaster begins to sink in, and the system warns him that solo players face a massive defense penalty, effectively forcing him to play on the hardest possible setting. While he quickly equips some wolfhide armor for a stat boost and resolves to prove that his individual strength is more than enough, ignoring the system prompt to rendezvous with a healing team because he knows his own goals and his own debts take priority, so he tracks down a local convenience store to scavenge for basic medical supplies before the real fighting starts. Stepping into the dim, quiet aisles of the shop, he moves with a caution that belies his calm exterior, grabbing some instant noodles and energy drinks to ensure he stays at peak performance during the long haul, when suddenly a frantic scavenger bursts through the doors, shotgun leveled and eyes wide with pure unadulterated terror, and the protagonist catches the sudden movement, his senses locking onto the intruder before he can even pull the trigger, as a literal horde of zombies spills into the store behind the fleeing scavenger, who cries out for help the moment he spots the protagonist. So the protagonist draws his new rare-grade blade, feeling the weight and the hum of power vibrating through his grip. And he launches himself straight into the fray, turning the convenience store into his personal slaughterhouse, slicing through the first wave with cold, efficient movements as he realizes trouble never waits to be invited, while the terrified scavenger tries to hide behind him, begging for cover as the zombies continue to pour through the entrance. So the protagonist pivots, his blade carving a lethal arc through the air, and he systematically dismantles the encroaching swarm, hacking through the undead with a precision that turns the store into a bloodbath. But as the first dozen fall, he begins to realize the threat is far from over. Because the number of zombies flooding in shows no signs of slowing down, the protagonist wonders if the corpses are somehow drawing the horde in, and the relentless noise of the undead starts wearing on his patience. Then a distinct, unnatural shriek cuts through the chaos, revealing a specific zombie at the center of the madness with a hollowed-out chest. So the protagonist deduces that this commander is likely emitting sonic waves to control the tide. Though the exit is currently blocked by the sheer mass of monsters, forcing him to adapt, he decides the commander has to be taken out before he can clear the path, and he orders the scavenger to focus his fire on the crowd to create an opening. But the scavenger panics, convinced he lacks the skill to handle such a massive swarm, so the protagonist demands 5 seconds of pure effort to turn the tide. Standing his ground as the pressure from the surrounding undead mounts, He quickly accesses his system panel to dump his spare points into agility, with his speed stat spiking instantly to give him the boost he needs. He kicks off the ground with newfound velocity, vaulting over the front line of enemies. While the scavenger provides the requested covering fire, buying him the necessary window, he maneuvers through the air, completely ignoring the lesser zombies in his path, and closes the distance to the commander with a single, precise strike, slicing through the creature's defenses as the blade connects with lethal intent. Realizing his gamble paid off as the commander falls, but the remaining zombies enter a berserk state, their stats surging as they lose their handler. The protagonist realizes the downed commander was nothing more than a distraction, as a fresh, enraged zombie lunges straight for him with lethal intent, forcing him to parry the strike while the rest of the horde converges. Their collective defense has spiked, making them far more dangerous than before, but he notices that no reinforcements are entering the store, offering a narrow window to escape, so he prepares to carve a path directly toward the exit. Checking on the scavenger who is struggling to hold the line, while the desperate man screams for him to keep moving, urging the protagonist to prioritize his own survival above all else. Yet the protagonist dismisses the idea of abandoning anyone choosing to commit, and the scavenger keeps firing his weapon to thin the herd despite the closing distance of the monsters surrounding him. The protagonist sighs at the sheer volume of enemies left to clear. Deciding that he must live up to the standard he has set, he flares his energy, pushing his stats beyond their previous limits. While the berserk horde watches him with hollow, glowing eyes, knowing that one mistake now means certain death, he launches into a flurry of strikes, cutting through the front line with ease, and the scavenger cheers in disbelief as the path clears before the protagonist silences him, demanding he focus on the escape. The protagonist leaps over the final line of zombies, landing right in the middle of their formation, while the scavenger screams in pure terror at the overwhelming odds, realizing his own stamina is plummeting as he struggles to maintain his speed. And the protagonist activates his wind control to propel himself forward with lethal precision, declaring that even if the zombies are shaking the earth, he has more than enough power to finish them, breaking out of the tide entirely as he walks away. Leaving the chaos behind them, he turns back with a smirk, feeling ready to take on any challenge that dares to show its face. Though the surrounding area remains eerily quiet as they continue their trek towards safety, and the scavenger remarks that the dungeon was surprisingly underwhelming, until a sudden cry for help echoes from a distance, shattering the silence. They rush toward the source and witness a survivor being brutally struck down by a massive shadow, as a hulking, horned monstrosity slams into the ground, obliterating the pavement and sending shockwaves through the air, while the protagonist catches the injured survivor, pulling him to safety just before the beast strikes again, and they watch in silence as the creature retreats back into the darkness, leaving the protagonist staring at the blood left on the ground, his expression hardening while the scavenger lets out a relieved sigh, thinking they managed to dodge a lethal encounter. But a gunner approaches them, warning that they were incredibly lucky to survive. And the protagonist listens intently, his eyes narrowing as he processes the gravity of the situation, while the gunner explains that the zombies in this zone are milder than the true threat roaming the area, because the king of the zombies emerges at sunrise and sunset, making survival impossible unless you remain hidden until the cycle ends. The gunner insists that death is unavoidable in this hellhole, so they retreat into a fortified safe house to weigh their options, where a terminal displays the inflated costs of basic survival supplies, and the protagonist wonders why clean water is priced so ridiculously high. He reaches out to test the pipes, realizing that drinkable sources are practically non-existent, but he sharply warns the scavenger away from the contaminated supply. The scavenger confirms the room's water has been stagnant for an eternity. Watching the older man, the protagonist notes that his reactions seem sluggish. Suddenly, a black, thorny root punctures the sink basin, confirming that the same parasitic growth from earlier is still spreading. They check the group terminal to see everyone's points and current rankings, and the protagonist decides to burn half his points on 10 bottles of water. A nearby survivor mocks his reckless spending, labeling him a show-off. The gunner fires back, claiming he has seen warriors die faster than anyone else, suggesting that their only hope is to force someone to stand guard tonight. The protagonist questions the logic, asking why they have not found a solution yet, because the zombie swarm gathers at night and will inevitably shatter their door. The gunner smirks, insisting that guarding the entrance is their only path to dawn, and the protagonist challenges them to survive the night before making demands, as the massive horde gathers outside, turning the entire building into a death trap. The protagonist stands alone in the hallway, staring down at the lifeless body on the floor, and he ignores the gunner's warning, insisting that water is his only priority right now. The gunner laughs, mocking him for not realizing the zombie king hunts only those with the highest points, while another survivor screams that the group is just setting him up to be a sacrificial lamb. The protagonist realizes they all pushed the monster-clearing work onto him just to make him a scapegoat. So he warns them that using him as bait will have severe consequences for everyone involved. As night falls, his skill level quietly ticks up. A sudden, massive impact shakes the entire building from the outside, and the gunner panics, wondering why the zombie king would attack this specific location. A nearby survivor suddenly transforms into an infected right before their eyes. The outer wall explodes inward as something massive tears through the structure, Debris flies everywhere while the group scrambles to survive the sudden breach. A monstrous creature lunges into the room, tearing through the floor with terrifying speed. The gunner breathes a sigh of relief, glad that the monster is focused on the protagonist, and the creature lets out a deafening screech as it locks onto its target. The monster reveals a glowing blue core in its chest, proving it is not hunting by points alone. The protagonist realizes the beast ignored him despite his high rank, meaning the criteria is something else entirely. He looks closely at the black parasitic roots spreading across the area. Then he touches the tainted water source and feels the connection to the monster, and he finally understands that the roots are tracking anyone linked to this contaminated water supply. The protagonist realizes the monster is hunting anyone linked to the contaminated water system, so he explains his deduction to the confused gunner, mocking the irony of their situation. Players traded their hard-earned points for water, unknowingly marking themselves for death. They were lured into a trap and infected without ever realizing they were targets. The beast stares down the protagonist, who decides to take the initiative. He charges forward with his blade, determined to strike the creature down first. The monster swings its massive claws with lethal intent. Steel clashes against dark energy as the protagonist parries the heavy blow. He screams for the others to run while the enraged beast lashes out. The protagonist yells for everyone to avoid the water supply and draws the creature away. He successfully baits the monster into a narrow corridor, knowing the confined space will restrict its movement and give him a tactical edge. The protagonist slashes at the creature, opening a deep wound. His blade bites into the monster, forcing it to retreat. They exchange rapid blows in the cramped hallway as the protagonist maintains his defense. He creates distance to analyze the monster's overwhelming strength. The protagonist decides that a direct confrontation is too risky given the beast's raw power. He pivots quickly to dodge a crushing strike that pulverizes the corridor wall. The protagonist keeps his guard up while looking for the slightest opening. He lunges again, narrowly avoiding a lethal grab as the fight reaches a breaking point. The protagonist declares his territory, and he launches himself toward the monster, committing to a final strike while the beast locks its glowing red gaze onto him, only to have his blade caught in the monster's iron grip, and the realization hits him that his movements are being predicted with impossible accuracy as he is forced to retreat from the creature's relentless assault, so he ducks into a nearby room to break the line of sight. But the monster continues to stalk him despite the darkness and distance, making the protagonist wonder how the beast can still track him so perfectly, while he moves deeper into the structure to regroup and rethink his strategy. But the creature closes the gap again, appearing right behind him in the hallway, and the protagonist questions why his stealth efforts keep failing. Then he narrowly evades another strike as the monster surges forward, parrying the blow while he keeps his focus on the beast's erratic behavior, until the truth dawns on him that the monster is not seeing him with its own eyes, because the entire horde of surrounding infected are serving as its visual sensors. So he shifts his plan to target the mob of zombies acting as the creature's vision, and he carves a path through the gathered infected, successfully cutting off the monster's sensory input as the creatures around it fall, which leaves the zombie king isolated and blind as the sun sets over the city, and he finally turns his focus toward dismantling the power source behind the horde. The protagonist realizes something is fundamentally wrong with the horde's behavior, and he barely dodges a surprise attack while watching the Shihao gunner scramble for safety. After landing in the shallow water that floods the floor, he notices the liquid acting as a catalyst for the infected, confirming his theory that the dungeon is recycling the sewage into a constant stream of new zombies, which explains why the resource management interface shows such a high cost for water. So he asks the Shihao gunner if the building's power grid is still live. Then he declares that he has finally found the key to breaking this stalemate, because the functioning elevators mean the building is still effectively alive and operational, which gives him the perfect trap to bury the creature once and for all. Seeing that the monster relies entirely on the surrounding horde to track his movements, he orders the Shihao gunner to follow his lead and keep clear of the infected water, while he draws the monster's undivided attention toward the elevator shafts, and they sprint toward the entrance as the beast tears through the hallway. The protagonist readies a device to trigger the doors, barely staying ahead of the monster's lethal claws. He pivots at the last second as the creature lunges, causing the monster to crash directly into the opening. Then he seals the doors tight to trap the beast in the shaft, and he draws his blade, knowing now is the time to finish the fight. The protagonist stands tall above the shaft, watching the monster struggle to climb up from the dark, and he realizes the beast has fallen right into his trap, so he decides to hide in the narrow gap between the elevator car and the shaft wall, reaching out to grip the structure. He starts climbing upward to stay ahead of the monster's reach, scanning the shaft for the best position to ambush the creature. He spots a weak point in the elevator's suspension, realizing the cables are hanging by a thread. He throws a rock to bait the beast toward the unstable platform, and the creature lunges toward the sound, landing with a heavy thud right where he wanted. He watches as the monster balances precariously on the damaged lift, readying his blade to strike the final blow. The elevator shakes under the beast's weight. He leaps down with a direct attack, plunging his weapon toward the monster's exposed chest, catching the creature off guard in the confined space. The monster swings out in a desperate counter, forcing the protagonist to narrowly dodge the lethal claw, and he prepares to finish the fight once and for all. The protagonist drives his blade deep with a final decisive slash, tearing through the creature's defenses as the massive energy discharge rips apart the shaft, leaving the beast crumbling into fragments beneath the weight of the blow. He stands amidst the debris, confident that he finally secured the victory. The onlookers rush in, breathless, shouting praises for his supposed triumph over the mutation. But the protagonist pauses, his brow furrowing as he realizes no system notification confirmed the kill. Sensing something is horribly wrong deep within the facility, dark, pulsing veins suddenly erupt from the floor, surrounding him in a web of necrotic energy. He recoils in shock at the sight of the corruption spreading across the room. Realizing the threat is far from over as the shadows begin to churn, the air grows heavy with the scent of death as the ground itself begins to writhe. A decaying hand bursts from the sludge, signaling a far more sinister presence. He puts the pieces together, understanding that the fight was merely a distraction, realizing the water system, the roots, and the zombies are all feeding a single, massive consciousness. The true zombie king is hidden at the source of the sewage flow. He swings his blade again, cutting through the encroaching vines that swarm toward him, retreating to gain distance. He steps back as the entire floor begins to pulsate. Red, vein-like tendrils blanket the chamber, turning the basement into a literal living nightmare. He braces himself for the inevitable confrontation, knowing the main boss was waiting all along, and the true horror manifests before him, a colossal, eye-filled mass surging from the depths. The protagonist resolves to take down this final monstrosity, firmly believing that victory here guarantees his exit from the entire dungeon. But the entity instantly traps him within a massive, pulsating web of red veins, forcing the protagonist to draw his blade as the creature lunges. Waves of infected drones swarm him from all sides, and he realizes the pincer attack leaves him zero room to maneuver. The surrounding space begins to rapidly shrink, trapping him in a narrow corridor as he fights to stay mobile. He slices through the charging horde, desperately trying to keep the path clear, while the protagonist notes that his movement is becoming increasingly restricted. So he pivots, parrying another strike before clearing the immediate area. Feeling the walls closing in as the dungeon layout shifts against him, he scans the chamber for a weakness that can turn this fight around. Noticing a flicker of electricity near a hidden distribution box, and a sudden plan forms as he sees the entity's blood vessels interacting with the power lines. The protagonist realizes that if the veins conduct power, he can use that current to fry the whole network. So he baits the creature, shouting a challenge to lure the mass toward the electrical source. The beast falls for the trap, surging forward with its entire red-veined core, and as the vines touch the exposed electricity, the protagonist strikes the box, unleashing a massive surge of current that incinerates the living nightmare from within. The electricity pulses through the protagonist, surging into the creature's central mass, and the entity shrieks as its entire biological network begins to unravel under the voltage. While the creature's core struggles against the current, failing to contain the discharge, the protagonist spots the exposed core, realizing this is the final opening he needs. So he commits everything to a decisive strike, closing the gap in a heartbeat, and his blade descends with lethal precision, carving through the monster's remaining defenses. The strike pierces the heart of the dungeon entity, sealing its fate for good, and a massive wave of energy detonates outward, leveling the surrounding structure while the core burns away into nothingness, leaving the dungeon void of life. The protagonist lands safely, the system confirming his clearance of the Cataclysm dungeon. And a treasure chest manifests out of thin air, signaling his hard-earned rewards. Shihao Gunner approaches, eyes wide as he offers the loot to the protagonist, while practically begging for his life, hoping his subservience keeps him alive. The space begins to warp as the system teleports them out of the ruins, and Shihao Gunner reaches for a smaller reward, his hands trembling in fear. He greedily grabs the box, desperate to secure something before they leave, but the protagonist stops him cold, claiming the superior rewards for himself, and the system interface prompts him to select his exclusive hidden rewards. The protagonist browses through the legendary gear options, discarding the common trash. He locks in his final selection, cementing the power-up that defines his next stage. The protagonist weighs his options, deciding that the legendary musket is decent, but the mystery reward could be worth even more. He gambles on the unknown, hoping to snag the Zombie King's sight or the Mother Plant's control abilities, and the system grants him the shared vision skill, allowing him to see through the eyes of his minions, followed by the consciousness control skill, which lets him manipulate others. Yet something feels wrong, as if the system is feeding him exactly what he needs. He recalls the dead boss reacting to his words, suggesting a level of awareness that should not exist. The dungeon settlement screen feels tailored to his specific desires, which makes him wary. He turns to leave the empty, dark corridor, sensing an unseen gaze fixed on him from the shadows. A heavy realization settles in as he connects the dots. He spots a container marked with a strange emblem, abandoned right where he finished the trial. That specific symbol confirms his suspicion of an outside presence manipulating the dungeon environment. The protagonist knows gray zone creatures should not be in dungeons, implying someone moved them here on purpose. All these rewards are clearly artificial bait meant to guide him down a pre-planned path. He begins to wonder if the entire gray zone is just one giant manufactured experiment. This discovery gives him a new target, and he vows to dig until he exposes the truth. He realizes he has finally touched the edge of a much larger, darker conspiracy. The system finishes updating, confirming his perfect clear and boosting him to level 4. He reviews his updated stats, seeing the legendary gear and new skills locked in his inventory. Double leveling up in one go is a massive jump, but it leaves him feeling unsettled by the system's influence. He checks a professional forum. Seeing the rarity of legendary gear and realizing just how much he has been handed on a silver platter, the protagonist accepts a massive bid for his gear, sealing the deal to clear his debts. His level 4 status and new skills are a nice bonus, but he knows this money is his real ticket out. Heading straight for the professional trading center, he intends to finalize the sale and get paid. The buyer hands over the payment, and his account balance instantly jumps to over 5 million. 3 suspicious men in suits intercept him, dropping a comment about his history as a low-level trader, challenging their prying. The protagonist stands his ground and demands to know if they are here for the loot. The lead man smirks, suggesting that high-end gear like that should not be in the hands of someone like him, warning them not to overreach. The protagonist cuts the interaction short and walks away. He slips into the back alleys to shake any potential tails. Checking his balance after the transaction, he sees the debt is finally gone, even if his liquid funds are low. Noticing a reflection in a window, he confirms the men in suits are definitely tracking his movements. Realizing he is being followed, the protagonist prepares to lose them in the maze of the city. The suits coordinate their pursuit, ordering each other to keep him in sight at all costs. Turning a corner, the protagonist vanishes from their view, leaving the pursuers confused and empty-handed. Watching them panic from the shadows, he scoffs at how amateur their tracking skills really are. He reflects on his situation, knowing that holding legendary gear was always going to paint a target on his back. A recruitment billboard for the administration bureau catches his eye, offering exactly the kind of assignment he needs. Planning to use the bureau's own resources against them, he decides to infiltrate their ranks to find the truth, walking into the bureau headquarters. He ignores the stairs and heads straight for the service desk. He tells the receptionist he is here to accept a high-priced dispatch assignment, ready to play their game his way. The protagonist pulls up his status screen, confirming he is currently ranked as a level 4 warrior. Onlookers nearby laugh at his audacity, mocking a low-level fighter for even attempting to sign up for a high-priority mission. The commotion draws the attention of the bureau vice president, who demands silence before demanding to know what the racket is about. Dismissing the protagonist entirely, the executive claims they have no need for low-level help since the gray zone is stable. Questioning that supposed stability, the protagonist challenges the executive to explain why he thinks the area is secure, predicting an imminent outbreak right by the city square. The protagonist catches the executive off guard with his blunt, accurate warning. The vice president scoffs at the bold prediction, telling the kid he has no idea what he is talking about, walking away as the executive turns his back. The protagonist calls out that the price for his help will skyrocket once the alarms start blaring. Watching him leave, the executive grumbles about the strange kid, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Meanwhile, the protagonist studies the city square, recalling how gray zone dungeons tend to spawn in high-density public areas. Analyzing the patterns of recent incidents, he maps out how the rifts concentrate from the city's outskirts toward the central hub. Digital overlays highlight the danger zones converging on the square, proving his theory that the next disaster is already locked in. Sitting on a park bench as the deadline approaches, the protagonist waits for the inevitable to unfold exactly as he calculated. Emergency sirens suddenly rip through the air, and red warning banners flood the bureau screens. Signaling a massive gray zone breach, panic explodes inside the office as the executive realizes the kid was right, the situation spiraling out of control instantly. A cold smirk spreads across the protagonist's face, knowing his gamble has already paid off perfectly. Dark, unnatural fog begins to roll into the square, swallowing the surroundings and signaling the arrival of the dungeon entities standing up amidst the chaos. The protagonist notes that those same bureaucrats will soon be begging for his assistance. He tightens his grip and prepares to step into the fray, ready to force the administration to recognize his true value. Civilians scramble for their lives as the rift fully opens, and the protagonist moves in to dominate the unfolding disaster. The dungeon entity erupts, snaring civilians in its lethal vine-like tendrils while the crowd scatters in total terror. A trapped man screams for help as the parasitic vines tighten around his throat, cutting off his air, hoisting him high into the air. The creature begins draining his life force while the surrounding chaos escalates. Tactical units arrive at the square, their heavy vehicles positioning to engage the massive, overgrown threat, ordering his squad to prioritize civilian safety. The team leader pushes forward under heavy fire from the encroaching vines. Ammunition feeds into the heavy machine gun, the metallic clatter signaling the start of a desperate counterassault. Bullets rain down on the monster, but the creature barely slows its relentless advance toward the remaining survivors. Soldiers attempt to flank the beast while it dodges, its vines lashing out with deadly precision at every turn. Boots slam into the concrete, closing the distance as the soldiers struggle to maintain their defensive perimeter. Pinned helplessly, the captive man continues to wither as the parasite feeds, his strength fading with every passing second. Veins begin to bulge under his skin as the creature's corruption takes hold, turning the host into a mere vessel. Reporting the dire situation, a soldier radios the command center that the hostages are already reaching a critical state. The team leader acknowledges the report. Realizing standard distance tactics are failing to penetrate the monster's thick hide, supplies are running dry, and the soldiers realize their firepower is insufficient to suppress such a high-level entity. A desperate transmission warns that the defensive line is breaking, demanding an immediate solution before the plaza is lost. Listening to the frantic update, the Bureau official understands that their current military assets are completely outmatched. The team leader confirms they need more time, pinning their last hopes on the protagonist they dismissed earlier, vowing to handle the creature personally. She coordinates one final push to contain the beast in the square. A blinding streak of blue energy slices through the air, carving a path through the monster's thickest vines. The soldiers watch in awe as the protagonist effortlessly cleaves through the creature, his power far exceeding their heavy weaponry. The protagonist finally makes his entrance on the plaza, instantly shifting the morale of the overwhelmed Bureau squad. The team leader tries to warn him about the danger, urging him to wait for backup instead of rushing in, but he brushes off her concerns, already focused on the threat lurking within the unnatural fog, moving with unmatched speed. He asserts that he can handle the monster entirely on his own. The team leader remains skeptical of his confidence. Doubting his ability to solo such a high-level entity, he counters by setting his price, demanding a massive reward and a premium contract rate for his services. She points out the monster is a level 81 threat that requires a full company to contain. The Bureau official watches the exchange, challenging the protagonist to accept full responsibility if his solo effort fails, putting his life on the line. He agrees to the wager but adds a new, steeper condition for his help. He demands that the Bureau roll out the red carpet and beg him to join their ranks after he wins. Suddenly, a young girl is snatched by the monster's vines, drawing a desperate cry from her mother. The protagonist immediately shifts his focus to the hostage, vaulting forward to intercept the beast. He realizes the creature does not rely on sight, reacting instead to the presence of people within a specific radius. Testing his theory, he notices the monster responds to vibrations transmitted through the ground. He prepares to strike at the root system, aiming to disrupt the signals before the monster can react. A surge of power flares as he prepares to cut off the anomaly's connection to the earth. Underground, the monster's primary body lies hidden. Sensing every movement through its expansive network of roots, he cuts the signal by channeling energy directly into the ground, severing the monster's sensory feedback. Raw kinetic energy tears through the soil as his strike disrupts the hidden network. The monster loses its grip on the hostage as its connection to the underground network fails. The protagonist unleashes a final decisive strike, pinning the creature with a network of energy blades, telling the beast that once it stops moving, there will be nothing left but to cut it down. He executes a lethal sequence of slashes that effectively dismantle the monster. Meanwhile, the rescued child and her family reach safety behind the police barricades. The team leader watches him finish the fight, realizing for the first time just how dangerous this warrior really is. A high-ranking Bureau official observes the entire operation remotely, processing the implications of the display. The battlefield falls quiet as the protagonist approaches the Bureau personnel. He reminds the team leader to hold up her end of the bargain regarding their agreement, gesturing toward the Bureau agents. He demands they fulfill their promise to recruit him formally. The team leader acknowledges his demand, her expression shifting from relief to intense curiosity. He hands over the identification and mission-critical data, insisting on the highest-tier dispatch listing. Claiming a legitimate identity will allow him to clean up future dungeons with even greater efficiency. He prepares to walk away, telling the team leader that she knows how to reach him when more work arises. She tries to stop him, desperate to understand how he predicted the appearance of the gray zone. The protagonist laughs off the question, hinting that the Bureau should have figured it out by now. He explains that these zones are man-made and follow a predictable, albeit hidden, pattern. Connecting the dots reveals exactly where the next incident will occur. He dismisses further questions by claiming this level of insight is simply his own unique capability. Deep within a secure facility, a masked figure stands before a glowing, high-tech observation interface. This observer notes that the threat was contained by someone, preventing a much larger crisis from unfolding. The masked observer realizes a variable has entered the equation, identifying 3 specific Bureau members who were involved in that earlier incident, and planning to lure them into the same dungeon to keep the trap shut, confident that the setup is already perfectly in place for them. While the protagonist finishes his own business and prepares to head out, a notification from the Bureau alerts him to a medium-scale gray zone emergency. Requiring his immediate assembly at a local elementary school, he accepts the mission without a second thought, knowing that these mid-sized zones offer high rewards but pose a serious threat to the public. The protagonist arrives at the scene to find a few others already waiting, where he meets the Bureau support specialist and a calm, collected partner. The specialist introduces himself as the healer, eager to work with the guy who cleared the last dungeon. They discuss the mission requirements, noting that only 3 elite members were authorized for this job. Standing before the cordoned-off area, the trio prepares to breach the perimeter. Crows scatter as the anomaly rips through the local infrastructure. The protagonist steps into the thick of the distorted space, finding the interior already swarming with unwanted scavengers from another guild. He recognizes them as members of the Interceptor Guild who thrive on looting dungeon gear. A hostile scavenger confronts them, demanding to know who authorized their entry, and mocks the Bureau team for being too slow to claim the best loot for themselves. The scavenger insults the Bureau team, calling them bureaucratic slackers who only get in the way, and he fires off a projectile to prove his point, but the protagonist stares him down, completely unfazed by the blatant disrespect. The team partner reaches out to hold the protagonist back, whispering that they should just watch and see how the rivals handle the fight first. The scavenger charges at the monster, landing a few strikes to show off his guild's dominance. Confident that he will secure all the glory and reputation for his crew, he turns back to mock the protagonist, questioning if he really intends to act as a stepping stone. The protagonist retorts that if the scavenger were actually capable, he would not be standing on anyone's head. A massive blow tears through the creature's armor, and the protagonist sighs, clearly unimpressed by the supposed difficulty of this medium-scale zone. The scavenger lights a cigarette, gloating over the kill as if it were a peak display of power, while the Bureau members scan the area, wondering why there is absolutely no high-level loot to be found. The scavenger also starts to realize something is wrong with the dungeon's composition. Suddenly, the black mist surrounding the fallen monster begins to churn and expand. The shadow of the beast reanimates, lunging toward the surprised Scavenger Guild members. Terror hits the group as they realize they failed to actually kill the target. The scavenger falls to the ground in panic, his confidence shattered by the sudden shift. The protagonist steps forward, telling the rivals to move if they are just going to be trash, and he draws his sword, ready to finish the job they botched. The shadow beast rips through the sky, its mass expanding with every pulse, and the creature's armored shell begins to crack open, revealing the true nightmare beneath. The civilians below finally realize the danger and scramble to clear the area. A massive multi-eyed insectoid monstrosity bursts out from the wreckage. Debris scatters as the beast slams into the ground, sending shockwaves through the entire block. The protagonist watches the impact, his focus narrowing as he readies his blade. He barks orders for the remaining civilians to evacuate before things get worse. A golden barrier hums to life as the protagonist engages the creature. Steel meets chitin in a shower of sparks while the beast lashes out. The protagonist finds his strikes deflected by the creature's rock-hard shell. Something feels off since the monster barely reacts to his precision strikes. This thing moves sluggishly and shows no instinct for self-preservation. He wonders if he is even fighting a living creature at all. The beast rears back, its mandibles dripping with a strange, dark essence. Another heavy blow lands, but the creature absorbs the impact without a flinch. He channels more energy into his sword, driving the blade deep into the monster's core. Glowing mana spills out, yet the creature remains standing as if fueled by nothing. The blade bites into the shell, finding no soft spot to end the fight. Too many mysteries surround this entity, but the civilians' safety takes priority for now, so the protagonist shifts his tactics to buy time, ensuring everyone reaches the extraction point. The protagonist orders a full retreat while others lead the civilians to safety, and the squad charges in to finish the creature during the evacuation. But a group of Interceptor Guild members claims the monster as their own prey, which sparks a heated protest from Ao since the civilians are still in danger. Yet the Interceptor Guild member ignores her, focused only on the bounty for the kill. He lands a massive blow that splatters the monster, though it immediately begins to reform. The protagonist warns the idiots that they are falling for the exact same trick. Green eyes glow from within the regenerating mass of shadows. Mana flows into the protagonist's blade as he prepares to intervene, tightening his grip on the hilt. He steps forward to cut through the confusion. A clean strike connects with the dark matter, and he follows up with a burst of energy to tear the entity apart. The creature dissolves into a swarm of tiny, insected components, leaving the Interceptor Guild members completely baffled by the monster's sudden disappearance. The protagonist realizes this nightmare is far more complex than a simple beetle. A massive, multi-eyed maw forms from the collective swarm, and the creature reveals its true nature as an amalgamation of countless tiny bugs. They scatter upon impact and reform instantly to confuse their targets. The protagonist activates his vision-sharing ability to track the swarm's movements, and a spectral bird emerges to help him hunt down every last insect. The protagonist spots the commander bug guiding the swarm, and he lunges forward to intercept the entity before it can spread further. Ao rushes in to provide support, but a stray projectile clips the Interceptor Guild member, leaving him more worried about his hair than the fight. The protagonist leaps onto a high vantage point to survey the swarm's distribution. Then he forces the collective mass to centralize. The commander bug tries to resist the pull, but without its exoskeleton. The creature is losing its structural integrity, leaving the swarm vulnerable as they cluster together on the structure. The protagonist readies his blade to finish the job once and for all. He calls out to his allies to target the densest point of the swarm, and Ao steps up to handle the heavy artillery, aiming a rocket launcher directly into the heart of the mass. She fires the payload, which impacts the bugs in a massive burst of flame, incinerating the swarm in a sustained explosion. The protagonist watches the fire consume the last of the commander bug, and the smoke begins to clear over the city block. The team regroups while the air finally settles, as the system confirms the medium-scale crisis is officially resolved. The system rewards the protagonist with a pair of elemental gloves, and he quickly equips them to hide his true stash of selectable gear. But the nearby Interceptor Guild members immediately start demanding a cut of the loot, insisting they weaken the boss enough to deserve a share of the sale, which causes the protagonist to snap back at their incompetence, reminding them they barely survived the fight while he handled the heavy lifting. Then a crowd of parents interrupts the argument to praise the administration bureau, thanking them profusely for saving their children while completely ignoring the guild members, and a young kid runs up to cheer for the protagonist as the real hero. While the Interceptor Guild member seethes in the background, plotting his revenge, suddenly the air ripples as the gray zone surges with unstable energy, and the protagonist realizes the crisis is not over because the portal refuses to vanish. The gray zone begins to twist and darken as it morphs into a full-scale dungeon, which threatens to tear reality apart if it finishes its transformation, and the system warns that ordinary civilians will be forcibly ejected, leaving only the professionals trapped inside to face the emerging threat. Arcane energy cracks through the air as the dungeon stabilizes, forcing the Interceptor Guild members to scramble for cover, while the protagonist and Ayao stand their ground to assess the new danger. And they watch as the boundary seals shut, locking them inside the nightmare. The portal pulses with a rhythmic hum, signaling that someone has just stepped through, and Ayao demands to know exactly who these new arrivals are. The three strangers claim they were just a nearby farming party swept up in the anomaly, but the protagonist immediately grows suspicious because the math just does not add up. He notes that the nearest large-scale dungeons are way too far to allow for such a convenient coincidence. One of the strangers smiles and asks if they can tag along to help run the dungeon, which triggers an outburst from the Interceptor Guild member who demands to know why they are being ignored. Though the strangers barely acknowledge the aggressive outburst, staying focused on the protagonist, he's not buying their friendly act for a second, especially since their positioning seems calculated to surround him and Ayao, noting that their eyes were locked onto their targets from the very first moment. And Ayao exchanges a sharp look with the protagonist. Realizing this is no accidental encounter, he concludes these three are definitely not just simple adventurers. The air shifts as the protagonist signals a move to disengage, and suddenly a massive wave of energy swallows the entire group. Reality distorts into a bizarre landscape filled with oversized, floating gaming dice. Everyone looks around in confusion as their surroundings completely vanish. The floor stretches into an endless, checkered board that defies all logic. A figure in a sharp tuxedo steps out from the shadows of this new domain, and the host introduces them all to a lethal game of chance called Player Paradise. The Interceptor Guild member demands an exit, aiming his club at the host, but the Arbiter doll responds with a chilling, silent grin, and before anyone can react, the host strikes back with terrifying speed, snapping the club clean in two to demonstrate the lethality of this game. Then he sprays blood across the floor as a warning that next time it will be a limb. While the Arbiter doll gleefully announces that the real rules are about to begin, the protagonist watches with intense focus, analyzing the potential of this massive dungeon as the host stands ready to explain the mechanics of this life-or-death board. And the game pieces begin to materialize, marking the start of the first phase. The Arbiter doll reveals that it is the team, not the individual, that moves across the tiles, with 9 participants divided into 3 teams, all dictated by the roll of the dice. The protagonist and Ayao exchange wary glances as they process the dire situation. Because the points rolled determine the number of steps taken across the board, and every move forces the entire team to advance as a single unit, the board contains only 2 types of squares: rewarding stars and dangerous skulls, where landing on the wrong spot triggers status anomalies or brutal combat events. The protagonist realizes this is just a twisted, high-stakes gamble with human lives, and the Arbiter doll explains that teams roll dice to determine who holds the initiative, with the highest score granting control over the progression of the round, granting the winner the power to skew risks, double rewards, or amplify penalties for their enemies. The protagonist realizes the team with the highest points does not just advance, but gains the power to skew the game against others, and Ayao notes that this mechanic is incredibly hostile to disadvantaged teams, forcing them to find a way to flip the odds. The Arbiter doll confirms their suspicion with a grin, encouraging everyone to play as ruthlessly as possible, while the protagonist remains skeptical of the host's claims, questioning if the game is truly just a roll of the dice. The Interceptor Guild member interrupts, relishing the chance to finally use the rules to crush the competition. The Arbiter doll explains the third rule, revealing that landing on a combat tile drags the entire team into the fight simultaneously. And if even one member of that team dies, the Arbiter doll deems the entire group eliminated instantly. The protagonist and Ayao stare at each other, fully grasping the weight of this collective fate. Realizing that these rules transform the board into a psychological cage where their survival is tethered to one another, the other participants watch in grim silence, clearly understanding that this dungeon is far deadlier than it appears. The protagonist wonders why the rest of the players seem so unbothered by such a lethal restriction. The Arbiter doll teases that there is another hidden layer to the high-tier resolution mechanic, and the dice materialize in the air above the board. Signaling the start of the first move, the protagonist watches the board closely. Suspecting there is much more to this game than the host is letting on, the Interceptor Guild member shouts at everyone to cut the chatter and finally get the game moving. The Arbiter doll signals the end of the rule reading, and the atmosphere in the room turns suffocating. Dice tumble across the board, setting the stage for the first round of movement. The participants brace themselves, tension thick among every team as the game officially kicks off. The dice spin rapidly in midair, deciding which group will seize the initiative. A result of 4 points lands for the led team, and the first phase of the game is underway. The first move lands directly on a trap, slashing the team's initial 4 points in half, and the Arbiter doll confirms the penalty, leaving the protagonist and Ayao with only 2 points to work with. The protagonist studies the opposition, wondering if their calm reaction is a calculated bluff or genuine confidence. He suspects the Interceptor Guild member had already predicted this outcome. Then a new roll of 6 points shifts the momentum back toward the aggressive bounty hunter, whose piece lands on a reward tile, granting them a situation-changing card that can force a specific dice roll. The Arbiter doll grins, revealing that this card allows the user to manipulate the point totals of any team on the board. Ayao watches in alarm as the Interceptor Guild member prepares to use the item to sabotage their progress. The bounty hunter cackles, declaring 3 points and a trap tile for the protagonist's team. The Arbiter doll activates the card's effect, overriding the previous turn to force a new, devastating result. 3 points land, triggering the trap and sending the protagonist's piece into a swirling vortex. The host announces that the initiative for this entire round now belongs solely to the Interceptor Guild member. The bounty hunter grips his head in manic glee, clearly enjoying the chaos he has unleashed upon his rivals. He ruthlessly forces their piece onto a trap tile designed to completely break their momentum. The protagonist and Ayao realize they are being cornered by a player who is willing to sacrifice everything for the win. The Arbiter doll presents 2 brutal resolutions, one forcing a loss of turn and the other pushing the team into a berserk combat state. Both options look like a death sentence, but the protagonist quickly identifies that the second choice might be their only path to survival. He rushes toward the combat option, leaving Ayao terrified by the sheer recklessness of his decision. The protagonist insists that entering the berserk state is the only way to avoid immediate elimination. He turns to Ayao with a look of ironclad resolve, promising that he already has a plan to flip this nightmare into a victory.